So thank you very much. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to speak about some of the challenges that we and our members are seeing from a European perspective as they look not only outside of Europe, but how European regulation is interacting with those in third countries, but also some of the tensions between European regulation and existing member state regulation. I'm going to talk about these topics over the next 8 to 10 minutes. I'll start by looking at the implementation of the G20 commitments and some of the challenges that are faced, then look at the impact of third country regulation, the number of equivalence assessments that are outstanding and some of the challenges that is giving rise to, the challenges of an inconsistent approach to equivalence across EU regulations, and then looking inside Europe, looking at the conflict with national insolvency regimes and some of the challenges that that gives rise to. These comments are very much going to be from a stakeholder perspective as to some of the challenges that industry faces when implementing European regulation. Many of the solutions to this will inevitably have to come from the regulator's perspective, and I suspect we'll talk about the challenges that regulators face in the panel session later on. So thinking about the European scope creep that I mentioned in the first bullet point there, the current wave of regulatory change in the derivatives market is largely driven by the 2009 G20 commitments from Pittsburgh. There are two key areas of scope creep. The first one was that all standardized OTC derivative contracts should be traded on electronic trading platforms or exchanges where appropriate, and cleared through central counterparties. So the focus very much on OTC derivatives, as was reflected in the way the US implemented that with Dodd-Frank. Whereas in Europe, we have EMIR and coming up MiFIR, MiFID II, which apply just as much to listed derivatives as they do to OTC derivatives. The second area of scope creep that is very material is reporting under EMIR. The G20 commitments required the reporting of OTC derivatives, whereas under EMIR, all derivatives, not just OTC, are reportable. On Friday, ESMA published on their website some statistics about reporting since February last year. 16 billion reports having been submitted since February last year, about 300 million a week. In April of this year, 69% of the reports that were filed didn't relate to OTC derivatives. So 69% of what's being reported doesn't actually meet a requirement that's been laid down by the G20 commitments. It is, if you like, gold plating some of the requirements in those G20 commitments. One of the other challenges we'll hear more about is the inconsistent timelines and the impact of those inconsistent timelines when it comes to implementing the G20 commitments. The US has gone first with a very single-minded approach. Europe is some way behind, and Asia is well behind the rest of the world. What is needed is the key stakeholders to come together to further discuss and develop a process of creating regulation that is mutually reinforcing of their respective agreed agendas, is globally consistent, and is harmonious when working with one another. There are numerous challenges in bringing about that reality, but it would start with a roadmap for agreeing such a process. As we think about how the differing approaches to implementation have caused challenges, what sort of things do we have on our mind? Well, reporting, single-sided versus dual-sided. I was in Brussels just on Friday last week talking at the EMIR review, and there was a clear clamour for single-sided reporting in the way that the US has implemented the G20 commitments. There are also differences of approach on pre-execution limit checks, the way that CCPs margin their members and the members margin their clients. Commodity position limits, the US started very small with just 28 key contracts being in scope, and that will be expanded in time. When MiFIR goes live, 1,900 contracts in the UK alone will be subject to commodity position limits with no grandfathering and no phase-in. The approach to exchange-traded derivatives, as I've alluded to, is different on both sides of the Atlantic, and indirect clearing that is causing such a challenge on this side of the Atlantic is not a major discussion piece on the other side of the Atlantic. Moving on then to the impact of third country regulation, the challenge, as we all know, is that derivatives markets are global, whereas regulation tends to be national or at best regional. This leads to a variety of challenges that the industry is faced with. If you're a US FCM, a US clearing broker, and you are a member of a European CCP, you're required to comply with the EMIR regulation just like any other member of that European CCP. The problem is that you can't offer individually segregated accounts in a way that is consistent with the US Bankruptcy Code that has not been recognised by EMIR to date. The other challenge is the number of equivalence assessments that are outstanding, and this stretches across EMIR in particular, but also MiFID I, and will be a challenge, no doubt, for the benchmarks regulation and MiFIR in due course. With MiFID I, the challenge is that exchange-traded derivatives executed on third-country venues are currently treated as OTC derivatives because of the lack of completion of the recognition process under MiFID I. That is bringing more people into scope for mandatory swaps clearing under EMIR. No countries have yet been assessed under Article 13 of EMIR, which means if I'm in Europe and you're in the US and we're entering into a swap that is required to be mandatorily cleared under both Dodd-Frank and EMIR, if we choose to clear that under Dodd-Frank, we don't currently meet our clearing obligations under EMIR because Dodd-Frank has not been recognised as suitably equivalent under Article 13. So that does need to be fixed before the clearing obligation goes live. Article 25 is a challenge for CCPs. Much is heard about the recognition of US CCPs in particular and the current tensions between the European Commission and CFTC on the approach that should be taken. MiFIR Article 46 will see the requirement for recognition for third country firms, and EU benchmark regulation is now going off on a different tack, potentially looking at compliance against IOSCO standards. The major problem that we've discussed with the European Commission is that there's a lack of a standardised approach to third country recognition carried out by the European Commission. Every time you get a different regulation, you get a different process. The process is not transparent, the process is not granular, and to the extent that timetables are set out, those timetables are rarely kept to. What Europe needs is, rather than treating equivalence as something that's up for negotiation through the trialogue process like any other provision, is to develop a standardised toolkit for recognition of third country jurisdictions with a transparent and clear process that sets out the detailed steps that third country regulations need to meet in order to be deemed equivalent to European regulation. It would also be useful if the European Commission could establish a small team of people whose sole job it is to proactively look at third country regulation and national member state regulation to identify in advance where potential and actual conflicts of law exist. How we determine equivalence is something that we'll talk about no doubt more in the panel. There are a variety of different ways of doing it. There's a unilateral recognition or mutual recognition. You can require cooperation agreements. You can consider how you stand against IOSCO principles. But finally, as we think about not only looking outside of the European Union, but also within the European Union, and we think about conflict with national law, I think that Nina put it very well, that the two main challenges are insolvency law and taxation, and the lack of a common approach to those two key topics within the European Union across member states. This is causing a problem under EMIR, and will do in due course for MiFIR, for indirect clearing, where there are certain features of EMIR that are liable to challenge by insolvency officials of the direct clients in that particular example. There's similar provision for direct clearing and similar uncertainty as to the extent to which European regulation can override national member states' insolvency law. It's not been tested in the courts, and the typical view is that the European Union doesn't have the competence, i.e. the authority in its treaties, to overrule national member state legislation, which is why the Capital Markets Union is such an important initiative as they look at the extent to which they can harmonise some of the differences between insolvency law approaches in different member states. So what does this actually mean in practice if we think about, well, how do we address all of these things? That's really where the regulators come in. The easiest way to mitigate the risks of regulatory arbitrage and to ensure internationally consistent regulation is to move forward to the same timetable as our immediate peers, to implement regulation in a consistent manner globally, to ensure that the European Commission is cognizant of any potential conflicts with third country laws and indeed existing member state legislation, and that any international standards that are agreed are sufficiently granular to give the regional implementers of those regulations the same approach when they come to write the rules that go implement those standards. The key global stakeholders, and I know we'll touch on this in the panel as to, well, who do we mean by that, should agree a roadmap by which to agree global regulation. And if FSB and IOSCO are not the right fora for that, then perhaps the time has come to create a new fora that is fit for purpose. A standard toolkit for equivalence determinations is needed, and the equivalence processes should be as transparent as possible with granular steps. We need to be able to say with certainty to third country regulators when their regulation is good enough in order to be deemed equivalent to European regulation. And for indirect clearing and other aspects of derivatives regulation, both cleared and bilateral, it is important that we manage to address some of the national member state differences in insolvency regulation. I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to discussing more on the panel.